Why was Albert Anastasia's underboss, Frank Scalise, murdered in 1957? A killing that inspired the classic mob movie, The Godfather. Let's check it out. I'm James Gladwish and welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, we are going to take a quick look at the theories surrounding the death of Frank Scalise. Frank Scalise, or Scalise, depending if you use the Americanized or Italian pronunciation, was a mobster in what we now call the Gambino crime family. His career in the American Mafia makes fascinating reading. But for now, here are a few highlights. After the murders of family boss Albaneo and his underboss Steve Ferrigno in the so-called Castellammarese War, Frank Scalise eventually becomes the boss of the family in 1930, with the backing of Salvatore Maranzano, who was the boss of what we now call the Bonanno crime family. However, after boss of bosses Salvatore Maranzano is murdered in 1931, Frank Scalise steps down as the head of the family and is replaced by Vincent Mauro, with Albert Anastasia as his underboss. Frank Scalise would remain an influential figure, particularly within the Sicilian faction of that family. In 1951, family boss Vincent Mauro and his brother Philip are murdered, and Albert Anastasia becomes the head of the family. And then, at some point in Anastasia's reign, Frank Scalise becomes his underboss. On June 17, 1957, Frank Scalise was gunned down whilst at a grocery store in the Bronx. As one newspaper reported, Scalise had just bought 90 cents worth of fruit from Enrico Mazzaro in Mazzaro's fruit and vegetable store at 2380 Arthur Avenue near 186th Street and paid for the food with a bill. He was stuffing $72 and his change back into the pocket of his flashy yellow slacks as he stepped through the doorway to the street shortly after 1:30 p.m. and met his death head-on. Mazzaro, after completing the sale, had gone to the street ahead of Scalise in order to tidy up his sidewalk displays. He gave police the only direct account of the slaying. "Suddenly, two men brushed by me," he said. "I heard some shots and I looked around. These two men were hurrying by me again. They weren't wearing coats and they had their sleeves rolled up. They got into an old black sedan and went up north Arthur Avenue." Scalise was hit with 4 shots in the larynx, the left cheek, right shoulder and right side of his neck. He toppled on his left side, sprawling over the bills and silver he'd been putting in his pocket, blood staining his light yellow shirt and slacks. The murder of Frank Scalise whilst buying fruit is often viewed as the inspiration for the scene where Vito Corleone is shot purchasing oranges in The Godfather Part 1. Many books and documentaries state that Frank Scalise was murdered because he'd been selling memberships, charging a price for mobsters to become inducted into the family. It is often said that family boss Albert Anastasia gave the order for Scalise to be killed, although interestingly, some sources often state that Anastasia was also involved with the selling of memberships. However, one FBI file provides another reason for why Frank Scalise was murdered. The file states that Albert Anastasia had Frank Scalise killed because he feared Scalise's growing power in the family due to the many mobsters that he had personally recruited. The file states, Albert Anastasia, fearing the power of Frank Scalise due to the many members he had brought into the organisation, had Scalise eliminated. On June 17, 1957, Frank Scalise was found dead in front of 2380 Arthur Avenue, Bronx, New York, from gunshot wounds to the head. Another file provides a different motive for the murder of Frank Scalise. This theory involves Vito Genovese and the greatly feared Genovese crime family mobster Vincent Mauro. The FBI file reads, approximately 10 years ago, Vinnie Mauro was acting as the chemist for opium, which he was converting to heroin. Mauro was allegedly getting his raw material from some place in Turkey, and after refinement, was selling his entire output to Chichi Scalise, probably Frank Scalise. Scaliz had 3 Italians working for him on the distribution of the narcotics, known only as redacted name, Little Tony, and redacted name. As time went on, all 3 of Scaliz's distribution men were caught and sent to jail. Little Tony got 10 years, redacted name got 12 years, and redacted name got 15 years. Redacted name found out in jail that he had cancer. Redacted name developed heart trouble, and Little Tony died. Redacted name and redacted name then wrote Scaliz that they had taken the rap, kept their mouth shut, and did not have long to live, and wanted big money to maintain their silence. Scaliz became genuinely worried that they would talk, so he went to Vinnie Mauro and asked Mauro if he would help him raise the money. Mauro stated that it was none of his concern since they were Scaliz's men, and Scaliz must raise the money himself. Scaliz then got word to Frank Costello, who was then in jail, but still the big boss, and requested Costello's permission to hold out payment on the next shipment of narcotics he received from Mauro, in order to use this money to pay off redacted name. Costello allegedly agreed to this plan, and Scaliz made known to Mauro at a restaurant located at 100th Street and 3rd Avenue, NYC, that he did not intend to pay him for the last shipment of heroin. So, from this part of the file, it would appear that Albert Anastasia's underboss, Frank Scalise, had been receiving heroin from Vincent Mauro, who was a mobster in the then Luciano crime family, of which Frank Costello was the boss. 3 of Scalise's men were incarcerated for their part in narcotics trafficking, but to keep their silence, they demanded a large amount of money from Scalise. Frank Scalise then reached out to Frank Costello and asked permission to withhold a payment to Vincent Mauro, so he could raise the money to pay the incarcerated individuals so that they would keep quiet. Frank Costello gave this plan the green light. However, it did not sit well with Vincent Mauro. The file continues. Mauro then went to Tony Bender and asked for his help in this matter, and to finance additional operations in narcotics. Bender went to Vito Genovese, and Genovese gave his okay, saying they would lend money for Mauro's operation, since the huge profits were supposedly worth the risk. In the meantime, Scalise had to be taken care of, and when approached again by Mauro for payment, told Mauro that Costello had given the okay for the non-payment. Mauro then took the word back to Bender and Genovese, who decided to hit Scalise, and this was accomplished within 10 days when Scalise was killed on the sidewalk at 180th Street and 3rd Avenue, NYC. So, according to this particular FBI file, Frank Scalise was murdered due to a non-payment of a drug debt to Vincent Mauro, and that it was Vito Genovese and Tony Bender Strollo who were behind the hit. At this time, Vito Genovese was Frank Costello's underboss, and Anthony Tony Bender Strollo was a captain in the family. The file continues. Frank Costello then got out of jail, learned what was going on, and that Scalise had been killed on the orders of Genovese. Costello became very angry, and a split developed, with Mike Miranda and Strollo siding with Genovese. The decision was made to hit Costello, and Vincent the Chin Gigante was chosen for the job. Gigante bungled the job, but Costello's wife became hysterical and said that she would leave her husband if he continued in the rackets. Costello allegedly asked Genovese, Miranda and Strollo to a meeting at the Molly Pitcher restaurant in Red Bank, New Jersey, and told the gathering that he was stepping down. He agreed to turn over his leadership to Genovese if they in turn would call off the hit. Costello explained that he was facing deportation proceedings, income tax troubles, and now the mutiny of Genovese and others, and he wanted to retire. This was agreed upon, and Genovese became the undisputed leader of the Costello underworld empire. So, according to the file, when Frank Costello found out that Vito Genovese was behind the hit on Frank Scalise, who was the underboss of another crime family, Costello was furious. And this added to the tension between Costello and Vito Genovese, which would ultimately culminate in Genovese ordering the failed hit on Costello later that year in 1957. This theory that Frank Scalise was murdered over narcotics rather than selling memberships is interesting. Another FBI file states that police at the time of the murder linked Scalise's death with narcotics. It states, for instance, on June 17, 1957, Frank Scalise of 211 Kirby Street, City Island, New York, was shot and killed by two unknown men in front of 2387 Arthur Avenue, Bronx, New York. Scalise was associated with Lucky Luciano and was active in narcotic circles. Furthermore, he was reputed to be an important member of the Mafia for the Bronx, New York area. His death is believed by the police to have been occasioned by a struggle within the Mafia for the control of the importation of narcotics into New York City and the distribution therefrom. Whether this is true or not is of course up for debate. The idea that Frank Scalise was killed for selling memberships tends to be credited to Genovese mobster turned informant Joseph Valachi. Valachi's testimony would state, Mr. Valachi, they use the expression books open and books closed. Actually, they mean that no member can get in as long as the books are closed. When I say they reopen them, that means you could have brought members in, like Frank Scalise and Albert Anastasia. They brought in a couple of hundred, which some of them they commercialized. Some of them paid up to $40,000 to get in. The chairman, some of them paid. Mr. Valachi, some of them paid. The chairman, when were these made? Mr. Valachi, after 1954. The chairman, about 1954. Mr. Valachi, yes. There is a school of thought, however, that leans towards the idea that Scalise and perhaps Anastasia weren't selling memberships for a set price, but were rewarding mobsters for being good earners, a practice that became commonplace in the Mafia in later years. Valachi himself even states that some mobsters were inducted by Scalise after they made him a partner in their business. Valachi would state, during the years 1953 and 1954, Frank Scalise, alias Cheek, who was Albert Anastasia's underboss, began making button men or soldiers out of a great number of Italians in New York. He made many of these soldiers in the Forum section of the Bronx, as well as the 116th Street mob under Vincent Squilanti, alias Jimmy Jerome. Scalise took many sums of money by making himself partner with these individuals and actually never returning their share of the operation. In many instances, he obtained sums in the amount of $40,000 to $50,000 from these individuals to make them mob members. They were brought in solely for the money-making abilities. The older element of the Cosa Nostra were displeased with these new men and felt they were not qualified and were misfits by the old rules. As with many mob hits, there are often multiple reasons for why a mobster is murdered. And perhaps Frank Scalise was killed due to a series of transgressions. In the comments below, let me know your thoughts on the topic covered in this video. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.